Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. Why don't we get started? Thanks for logging in. Obviously, this wasn't the format that we had in mind, but happy that you all could join us. So first, just a little bit of housekeeping. I should introduce myself. I'm Matt Chingos. I'm Director Center on Education Data and Policy at the Urban Institute, and I'm joined by my colleague Erica Blom, a research associate here at Urban. And I guess by here I'm in my house, but can still pretend that that I'm at Urban. We're recording this session, and we'll try and find some way to make it available to folks who couldn't join us. So just wanted to make sure folks were aware of that. Let me share my screen so we can get started with the slides. All right, so I just wanted to start with a quick kind of set of goals of the workshop today, and just an overview of the layout. We're going to go back and forth between me and Erica to mix it up a little bit, so just bear with us as we shift the sharing of screens so we can each control the slides. But I'm going to start off by giving you an overview of the Education Data Portal, which is our effort at Urban to make these different K-12 and higher ed data sets available. Erica is then going to do more of a deep dive on the higher education data sets that we have in the portal, and then also just about those data sets more generally. So I know we probably have folks in the workshop with a range of backgrounds, so this will be familiar to some of you, but we really wanted it to be useful to folks who don't know much at all about these data sets, but then also for folks who know them a little better to get a sense of some of the tools we've made available to make the data sets easier to work with. I'll then take it back and provide an overview of the different access tools we've built to access these both K-12 and higher ed data sets, but once again with a higher ed focus given the theme of our workshop. And then I'll turn it back to Erica, and she'll do a deep dive on the IPEDS finance data, which is a particular data set of IPEDS that we have just added as of a couple of days ago to our data tools, and created a cleaned up panel sort of building on what the Delta Cost project used to do but hasn't done for quite some time. So that's the plan, and we'll aim to pause after each of these sections to see if folks have questions. It looks like we don't have a super huge group, so I think to ask questions, just unmute yourself and jump in, and if that gets unruly, we can try and use the chat feature or something else. But since it is a relatively small group, I think that could be a good way to do it. So let's get started. What is the data portal for folks who aren't familiar with it? It's the one-stop shop we've built here at the Urban Institute for all major national data sets on schools, districts, and colleges. The key feature is we've built harmonized panels of both pre-K-12 and higher education data going back as far as the 1980s for some of the data sets. We've included the link here to the documentation site. If you go to educationdata.urban.org, that takes you to our point-and-click Explorer tool, and there's a button to get you to documentation, or you can go directly to that URL. And I'll get into this in more detail in a little bit later in the workshop, but the basic idea is to harmonize these different data sets. So this is just an example here from the IPEDS fall enrollment by race and ethnicity data. On the left is a screenshot from the Excel file documenting the codebook for the 2018 data. So you can see you get all these different variable names that are sort of incomprehensible, and they give you these different counts of these different, is it, the undergraduate students, the full-time or part-time students, and then different racial, ethnic, gender groupings. And then on the right, you can see the first part of the HTML codebook from the 1997 version of the same file, which was formatted in a different way with somewhat different variable names. And so really what we've done is taken all of this, which is obviously a little bit different every year with some major changes at different parts in the data series, and put it into something cleaned up. So this is just a snippet of our documentation site for the same data set, the IPEDS fall enrollment data. And we've taken all that. Now it doesn't matter whether you're in 1997 or 2018, you are looking at, these things are coded the same way. And obviously sometimes the data coding shifts in terms of different numbers of racial and ethnic groups, for example. But we've standardized, harmonized everything to the greatest extent possible to make it easy to work with these data for different years and to make it easy to construct panels over time. So I'm going to just give you a quick overview of the data sources so you can just know about them, what's in both the K-12 and higher ed side, and then Erica will go into more detail on the higher ed side. So on the K-12 data, we have data on both schools, individual schools and school districts, including both regular, traditional geographic school districts, but then also administrative units, charter operators, things like that. So we have the Common Core of data, which is sort of a directory of all the public schools and school districts in the country with information about their enrollment breakdowns by race and ethnicity, things like that, information on the finances of the school districts. That goes back to the 1980s. More recent data collection, the civil rights data collection has information on discipline, things like that. We have the SAPI data from the census, which are estimates of poverty rates, including child poverty rates at the school district level, geographic school districts. We have EdFacts data on school level test scores, so proficient numbers on math and reading tests in grades 3 through 8. And then we've generated a robust set of geographic identifiers. So you can take any school in the country and you can put it in its census tract or its block group or its metropolitan area. And you can do that for the various different definitions of those that have evolved over time. So useful for research projects that involve historical data as well as contemporary data. And then the higher ed side, we have a lot of the IPEDS components, college scorecard, one component from federal student aid, and a similar set of robust geographic identifiers for colleges, similar to what we did for schools. We have more data in the works. This year, we're planning to update many of these data sets. You know, the Department of Ed has put out a new year of data, both K-12 and higher ed, and so we're trying to keep up with that and keep these up to date as possible, adding more components from the civil rights data collection that we don't currently have, adding graduation rates for high schools from the EdFacts data, adding more components of the IPEDS, since we don't currently have all of them, and then adding more FSA data sets. And Erica will talk about that in a minute. And then we have different data access tools, including an API for programmers and developers, data in R packages for researchers, and what we call the Explorer, which is a point-and-click interface to make these data accessible to folks who don't have programming skills, but just have a web browser and want to get a little bit of data. And a little later in the presentation, I'm going to dive deeper into each of those and kind of walk you through how it works with a focus on how you might use it to access some of these higher education data sets. So why don't we, I can pause quickly for questions. We're probably going to answer a lot of them in the next couple of sessions, but any just general questions about the kind of goals of the workshop and the data portal more broadly. All right, great. So Erica, why don't you, now you can watch us struggle with the technology. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Erica, you share your screen and take it from here. All right, just make sure to unmute yourself.
Yep, thanks, Matt. Okay, now we're queued up, and I think, am I sharing the full screen here?
Yeah, looks good on my end.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a walkthrough through the higher education data sets that we have in the portal at the moment. And then at the end, I'll go a little bit more detail into the IPEDS finance data set specifically. So quickly, for people who are unfamiliar with IPEDS, this is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System that's been collecting data since about 1980, and they have a number of different survey components that are administered throughout the academic year. So we have the directory, which is basically what it sounds like. It just has, you know, basic information about each institution, sort of the level they control, sort of whether it's private or public, address information, websites, that sort of kind of boring but necessary stuff. Institutional characteristics goes into a little bit more detail about different offerings. So whether they have programs offered at different levels, postgraduate, undergraduate, certificate level, that sort of thing, as well as distance ed, whether there's on-campus daycare, whether there's room and board, that sort of thing. Admissions gives you numbers of applicants, numbers admitted, and the number who finally enroll, and also provides admissions information on admissions requirements. So whether different things are required, like test scores or high school rank, as well as SAT and ACT 25th and 75 percentiles. We also have lots of enrollment information. So we have full-time equivalent counts. We have fall enrollment by level of study, full-time, part-time, race and sex, as well as by age and sex. And also fall enrollment for freshman students by state of residence. And finally, we have head count, which is basically just counting every single student throughout the entire school year, which is a better measure of enrollment for schools that don't operate on kind of a traditional academic schedule. So the fall enrollment is not as meaningful for them. And finally, we have a fall retention, which is just capturing the share of students who re-enroll as sophomores the following year. We have the finance data, which we just added a few days ago, so I'm not going to talk about that much now, but we'll go into that a little bit more detail at the end. Student faculty ratio, which is exactly what it sounds like, number of students divided by the number of faculty. Graduation rates, we have these by 150%, 200%, and by type of federal aid. So these basically are saying 150% is for a 4-year college. That's basically saying what fraction of students graduate in 6 years, and for 2-year colleges, what fraction graduate in 3 years. And this is provided for first-time full-time students, so not all students. And they also have sort of 200%, which also includes 100%, so 4-year graduation rates for 4-year institutions and 8-year graduation rates for 4-year college students. It's also broken down by type of federal aid, so Pell Grants or subsidized loans. So you'll notice I mentioned that this is only for full-time, first-time students, which leaves out a lot of students. So outcome measures was a recently introduced survey by IPEDS that tries to rectify this and provide graduation rates as well for part-time students and non-first-time students, so basically transfer students. There's also counts of completers. So these are just the number of students who are graduating with any degree or certificate each year. And then we also have the number of awards handed out. So this is by 2-digit and 6-digit zip codes, which are classifications of instructional programs. So basically majors at different degrees of disaggregation. So 2-digit is highly aggregated, that's things like history, and 6-digit is much more detailed, like American history or something like that. And those are broken down by sex and race. And finally, we have some information on academic libraries, which is number of holdings, like physical and digital holdings, that sort of thing. There are still a number of components of IPEDS that we haven't yet included, but plan to within the coming year. So information on pricing and tuition, that's forthcoming, as well as student financial aid. So those are 2 really big pieces that are we're working on including, as well as human resource information. So the number of staff in different categories and their salaries. We've also linked up a number of the college scorecard data sets. So some of you may be aware that the college scorecard put out some program level statistics this fall. So we haven't included those yet, and we're still discussing whether that would be worth including, and we're also eager to hear your feedback on whether that would be useful to include. But basically for college scorecard, what we have here are institutional characteristics. And so these are similar but slightly different than the IPEDS one. So these are things like whether it's a minority serving institution or women's only college, that sort of thing. Student characteristics. So these are student aid applicant characteristics, which are things like their family income, different demographic characteristics, whether they're dependent or independent students, as well as their home neighborhood characteristics. So things like the average education level or average income or racial breakdown in the zip code where they were when they applied. We also have earnings organized by years after entry, so typically 6, 8, and 10 years after entry. Cohort default rates and repayment rates, which are organized by years since entering repayment. So I think those are 1, 3, 5, and 7 years after repayment. Federal Student Aid, the Office of Federal Student Aid, we have just started including some of their data. As Matt mentioned, right now we just have the financial responsibility composite scores, which are just scores of the financial stability of various colleges. But we're planning to include grant volume, loan volume, and campus-based programs volume. So these are things like, you know, the amount of Pell Grants that are dispersed at each college, as well as loans and each of the various campus-based programs as well. Matt also mentioned that we have a number of geographic data points linked to all of these colleges. So we got data from the National Historic Geographic Information System, I think is what that stands for. So we took all colleges, and IPEDS provides latitude and longitude for these colleges, and we mapped them to census block groups for 1990, 2000, and 2010 census geographies. And so this gives you information that you can then link to data from, say, ACS or other sources, including things like census tract, census place, PUMAs, which are public use micro areas that the ACS uses, state legislative districts, CSAs, et cetera. So a variety of different kinds of geographies. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt, but if there are any questions at this point, I'm happy to try to answer those.
Any questions for Erica about sort of what do we have in there and plans for other things we might add, other data sets people are interested in? All right, well then I will share
Can
my
I ask
screen.
one question?
Yeah, go for it. Robert.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Just Erica, thank you so much, and Matt, thank you so much for hosting this. I was just wondering about the awards with the 2-digit and the 6-digit SIPs. Could you elaborate on what you mean by awards? If it's 4-year degrees, 2-year degrees, certificates, if it's broken up in different ways. Thanks very much.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so it's all of those things. And yes, it is broken down by all of those different levels of study. Yeah, so you can get the number of certificates in a particular field or the number of 4-year degrees in a particular field. Yeah, so there's a lot of data there.
That's probably the most detailed data IPEDS has on participation in different degree programs, especially broken out by student groupings like race and ethnicity. So the enrollment data by major aren't nearly as good. They're bigger groupings, whereas the degree data, obviously you lose the people who enroll but don't get degrees, but the degree data are very rich because you can get down to that 6-digit zip code, and then within that get breakdowns by race and gender. So you can know, for example, how many, you know, Hispanic women got degrees in sociology at a particular school in a particular year, and track that over time. All right, I'm going to share my screen now and get to the next section of this. All right, so I'm going to do a quick tour through some of the different data access tools. Have lots of screenshots and encourage folks to go and you know, play with these different tools on their own. So the first one to know about is the API documentation site. So first, let me spend a minute just saying, well, what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. And what it allows us to do is to have a sort of single source of data, but all of these, you know, these are obviously federal data sets that our team at Urban is cleaning up, harmonizing, standardizing They then go into a single database, and the API is a machine interface to that database that allows, sort of creates a standard language and protocol to build different access points to the data. And I'll talk about what those different access points are in a minute. And the documentation side is where you can get the most detailed information that we provide on all of the data sets, variables, values, et cetera. So here's a screenshot of what it looks like. As you can, so here's for colleges. As you can see, it's organized into topics, which is sort of what's the data about? Is it about a school districts, or colleges? And today, obviously, we're going to be focused on the data on colleges. And then within each of those topics, it's organized into what we call endpoints. And an endpoint is, it's sort of like a data set. I think it's best explained by example. So IPEDS is not an endpoint, but the directory, IPEDS directory data are an endpoint. The institutional characteristics data are an endpoint. And then within enrollment, full-time equivalent enrollment is an endpoint. Fall enrollment by level of study, full-time, part-time status, race, and sex is an endpoint. Fall enrollment by age is a different endpoint. And you can click on each of those endpoints and get a bunch of information. So here for the IPEDS directory data, you can scroll down and see there's a variable that we call urban-centric locale. And if you were to mouse over that I, the blue I circle is a tooltip. It would tell you a little bit more information about that variable, some details. And then here's where if you just went and pulled the data off the API, you'd get urban-centric locale with values 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And here's where you can go to find out exactly what those different numbers mean. And I'll show you in a minute how Stata will do that for you automatically, so you don't have to do it that way. But that's where that documentation is. And then over here on the right-hand side, you can see we give code examples in 4 different programming languages: Stata, R, Python, and JavaScript. So Stata and R are going to go through packages I'm going to show you in a minute, and then Python and JavaScript I'm not going to talk about today, in part because I don't know much about them. But those are programming languages that you'd be more likely to use if you were a developer building something that's hitting the API directly, rather than through an intermediate access tool like a Stata or R package. And then we do have this option to download the data. So if you just come here and you don't want to mess around with any of this stuff, you just want, give me all the years, the full IPED directory panel going back to the late 80s, you can just download it there. Of course, you'll have to label everything up yourself. So we'd recommend, the Stata package with the CSV option is a better way to do that. But if you just want a CSV with the data, we also do give you that option. So you can click on those sample codes. Here's Stata and R. I'm going to go through those in more detail in a minute, but just to show you kind of what that looks like. If you were to click on those, what you would get. And then in this case, if you were to click on the download data set, you'd get, there's a code book and then the complete IPEDS directory file for 1980 through 2017. For some of the bigger data sets, like Robert mentioned, the 6-digit zip codes, those are much bigger. So we're not going to post those as a single CSV for 30 years of data. We're going to post them year by year. So then you'd have to download them one at a time, or you could write a loop somewhere to just, cycle through them. But once again, we've set up packages to do that. So for most researcher types, this probably is not the best way to do it, but we give you the option if that's what you want. So let me talk for a minute about the Stata and R packages. And I'm a Stata person, so I'm going to focus on that. But the R package is pretty similar. So these enable you to pull data from the portal directly into Stata or R. They're the most recommended way. If you're going to work in Stata, I think these are the best way to work with these data sets. If I'm working with these data sets now, I use the Stata package since I'm a Stata person. If you go to that API documentation site on the left-hand side, you can click through to the instructions to download the package. For Stata, it's pretty simple. It's a net install command, but we have a couple details there that there's 1 or 2 other packages you might need first. And if you have trouble, we have some, for most common problems people have, we have the solutions on that documentation site. So the package, it's called education data, all one word. And here's what the syntax looks like with an example. So it's a topic, source, endpoint syntax. So you're always going to say education data using, and then in quotes, the first word is going to be school, district, or college. So here we're going to do college. Then it's going to be the data source, which for this example is IPEDS, and then the endpoint. And if you look at the help file for education data, it'll tell you what the endpoints are called in the package language, because obviously they're going to be abbreviated. And then you can easily subset the data. So if you just did education data using college IPEDS grad rates, it would pull in everything. That's a big file. You're going to be sitting there for a very long time. If you do want to get big files pulled into Stata, we recommend using the CSV option, because what that does is instead of going through the API and downloading the data basically 1,000 rows at a time and cycling over that, it's efficient if you just want a little bit of data to sort of go and to get just what you want. But if you want big files, put that CSV option, and then instead of downloading the data 1,000 records at a time and putting it all together for you, which is slow, it'll download that CSV and put on all the labels, make it look nice. So that's why I say don't download the CSV from the website, download the CSV through the education data package. And if you're a Stata person, it's a much better way to go. If it's a big file, you still might be waiting there a little while, but definitely faster than any other way you could do it. In this example, what I'm doing is I'm saying, give me data on one unit ID, right? And unit ID is the identifier that IPEDS uses. So I think this is the University of Washington's Seattle campus. So give me unit ID 236948. Give me a bunch of years, give me 1996 to 2015. Obviously, I could ask for just 1 year or a different range of data. Give me so for this data set, if you went to the API documentation site, you'd see that it's broken into different sub-cohorts. So these are bachelor's degree seeking students. And then the column option is giving us particular columns. It's as if I ran this and then said, keep just those variables. So if you don't want to see a bunch of extra stuff, you can put that column option, and it's just going to give you the year, race, sex, and the completion rate, right? So it would say for 1997, for white males, the completion rate was whatever it was. And then the clear option, it just clears out whatever memory you have in data, because obviously you're loading new data into memory and Stata. So that's just saying it's okay to clear out what you're currently working with. So when I punch this in, I'll give you, this is what it looks like. The first thing, it's going to give you a time estimate. It's approximate. It depends on the speed of your internet connection. It depends on who else is using these tools at the same time. But it'll give you an approximate idea. If it tells you it's going to take 13 hours, you might want to try that CSV option. Or you might want to go and take a break and do something else and not sit and wait for it. In this case, we're just pulling a small amount of data, really 24 records, which are graduation rates by race, ethnicity, and gender for one institution. So 24 records a year, but it has to search, hit each of those years and then go through, thousands, if not millions of rows to find just those 24 records for you and pull them in. So this is saying it'll take between 1 and 7 minutes. I think when I ran it, it was on the lower end of that. So it'll then crank through the API. It'll get through all those endpoints. In this case, each year of the data is actually a separate endpoint. You can see the number of records gets larger in later years, and that's because there's more racial ethnic groups in the later years than in the earlier years when the federal government started separating out Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and created 2 or more races as a category. So you load the data into Stata. You then click the Browse button to see what you're looking at. And the nice thing about the Stata package is that it labels the variables for you using the same labels that we have on the documentation site. And then it also labels the values. So you don't have to go and figure out, well, what does race equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 means? It's coded that way, but if you're a Stata person, you'll know that blue means you're seeing the labels. And then if you wanted to go and make a quick chart, here's a chart showing those same data we just pulled in, right? So I think the real power of the data portal is that in the old days, you'd have to spend half a day wrangling 20 different files from the IPEDS data site, making them all the same formatting, and here this was something that once you're comfortable using the data portal in Stata, you probably could do this in 10 minutes, right? It was literally just this one line of code that I showed you, and then one line of code to make a Stata chart, and there you have it. I'm less familiar with R, haven't used that in quite a while, but just to give you a sense of what that looks like, it's pretty similar. Obviously in R you have these objects, so here we're creating an object called data, and we're using the get education data command, and then we're specifying within that the level, whether it's school, college, school district, or college, university, the source, the topic, where the topic is the endpoint, and then we can have a set of filters where here I've said 2002, but we also could have done the same thing we did in Stata before. Give me this unit ID, give me this year range, give me this subcohort. And if you go into the help package for R, it'll sort of walk you through the different options that are available there. So as folks are increasingly using R and other open source software, it's a great option for those folks. So the last way to access these data is our Data Explorer. It's a point-and-click online interface. It includes all the variables in the portal, but it's really best used for smaller data requests, such as a single college or all colleges in one state. So if you want to go and get all the colleges in the country, the Explorer is not a good way because we're going to make you type in the names of 50 states in the District of Columbia. It'll be very slow. If you're working with K-12 schools, you'll just break it because you'll be asking for too much data than it's really designed to spit out. So if you're working with big data sets, this data in our packages are definitely your best bet. But I personally use the Explorer when I want to do something kind of quick. So this little example here with one college and some different things over time, this is something that I might actually do in the Explorer. Especially if I wanted to pull data from multiple data sets. One advantage of the Explorer that it does, the data package doesn't do, is it merges data sets. So let's say you wanted to pull all the colleges in Texas and you wanted to know their names, so you have to get the directory data, and then you want to get their graduation rates, that's a different file. So in the Stata package, obviously you're a Stata programmer, that's pretty easy. It's 2 commands, you'd save a temporary file, you'd merge them together. Wouldn't take you that long. But if you're just doing something quick, you don't want to fire up Stata, you can pull up the Data Explorer, click a few buttons, and it merges everything for you on the fly. So I'm going to walk you through an example where I'm going to do the same thing the Stata package just did, except I'm going to do it using the point and click Explorer tool. And to get to this Explorer tool, you go to educationdata.urban.org, which right now takes you directly to the Data Explorer, which is the URL you see on the screen here. So when you get there, it's organized in a similar way to everything else. Once again, schools, districts, and colleges, you have to decide what is it that you want data about. The homepage gives you kind of a quick tour of how you do it. You pick the institutions you want, you pick the data you want, you export it, you use it. So if I were to click on colleges, this is what I see. First step is to choose institutions. So keeping with our example from before, it defaults to just the most recent year of data, which is 2016 in IPEDS. We'll have that updated later this year. So I'm saying give me 1996 to 2016. I then type in Washington, which I have to at least put one state in. If I don't put a state in, then I'm not going to get any data. So I type in Washington, which is the state of Washington, not the District of Columbia. If I were to stop there, I would get data on all of the colleges in the state of Washington. I could filter them. I could say, give me the publics, give me the 4 years with those institution level and controls down there. In this case, I just want one college. So now that the tool has loaded up all the colleges from Washington, I can start typing down here and it will, and I can find the University of Washington, Seattle. So once I punch that in, I'm no longer getting all the colleges in Washington. I'm just getting the University of Washington at Seattle. So that's the Choose Institutions tab. If you see next to the Choose Institutions tab, you see Choose Your Data. So you click on that, and you're gonna have all these different drop-down menus. I've put in the green box here on your screen what I wanted, which is graduation rates. So I click there, graduation rate within 150% of normal time, right, which is 6-year graduation rate at a 4-year college, which is what University of Washington, Seattle is. I then go to Group By, and I pick total, and I pick by race and ethnicity. So it's gonna, so I'm saying that those are the breakdowns I want. I then click the Generate button in the upper right-hand corner, and it's going to take a few minutes because once again, it still has to cycle through those 20 different years of data and then stitch it all together for you. So you may be, your browser may kind of hang for a minute or so while it does that. I have screenshots here, so we don't have to sit and wait for it. And in this case, I'm getting 3 files. So no matter what you ask for, you always get that first file, which is the breakdown by institution, whether it's a school, a district, or a college. And in this case, it's by institution and by year. So it's going to be for each year from 96 to 2016, some of that directory data. You're always going to get a data dictionary, which tells you the variable names, the data source, and any information about that variable. So you don't have to go to our documentation site and look it up. It's put there just for the data you asked for. And in this case, I also asked for some data that were broken down by race. So the Explorer is always going to spit things out in long format if you ask for breakdown. So if you ask for breakdown by race, you're going to get a file here, and I'll show it to you in a minute with graduation rates by race. If you also ask for graduation rates broken down by Pell status, that would be in a separate file by Pell status. So you do have to, stitch those together, because if you were to, ask for data by 6-digit zip code, for example, obviously it's going to be a very long file, and we wanted to leave it to users how to deal with those. So the top file is our just institution-specific file. So anything you ask for, in this case, I sort of by default got some basic information about this institution, and I got its overall completion rate. If I said to also tell me its average SAT score, that's obviously not broken down by anything. It would be in that top file. The bottom file is the file broken down by race. So if I also asked for fall enrollment broken down by race, that would be merged on and put into this file. So you get, so whatever the unit of analysis is, whether it's the institution or the institution by year by race or by Pell status or what have you, will be in a separate file. So yeah, so that concludes my kind of tour of these different access tools. I know that was a little bit of a whirlwind, and encourage folks to kind of play with these yourselves at home. But kind of wanted to pause there before we get into the IPEDS finance data and see if folks had any questions about the point and click explorer, about the API, about the data in our packages.
I do have a question. When you did the subsetting command, you were able to pick out a specific unit ID. Can you do that for any of the variables that are in the file, or are there certain fields that has to apply to in the data package you were sort of subsetting?
So I believe how it works is if the variable is a filter, so if you go to the documentation site, see how it says filter there, that means it's something you can filter on. In general, you can filter on most things. I think the numeric ones, we tend to allow filtering on those. I think the strings, I'm not sure we and Erica jump in if I'm getting this wrong, but I don't think we allow filtering on strings as much. But I think we've tried to make it as flexible as possible. So you can't say filter name equals University of Washington, and you wouldn't want to do it anyway because the name changes over time. But if you look up the unit ID, you can filter on that.
I have a quick question here.
Yeah, go ahead, Dean.
Yes, hi Matt. Thanks for doing this for everyone. When we are getting data from Stata, for example, aren't we like pulling, I'm just trying to understand the mechanics here. Are we pulling data from the API like platform also, or this is like a different, when we install it, we basically install the education data package, and then we're getting data from that package. API is just a different platform. I'm trying to understand the mechanism here.
Sure. Yeah, so the API is what enabled us to write this data package. So this data package is just, so if we didn't make this data package or you didn't like this data package, you could write code in Stata that would go directly to the API. But the API puts out some data in something called JSON format, which is which is not that familiar to me. It's more familiar to developers. So the package is sort of like it's kind of like Google Translate for for people who aren't API people. So people like me, I use Stata. I think in Stata syntax, you give it Stata syntax. The Stata package changes that into API syntax, gets the data from the API, and then puts it into Stata format for you. So you're getting the same exact data you'd get if you went straight to the API, just in a format that's a little more Stata friendly.
Got you. Okay, that makes sense. I was just being curious, how does this magic happen? And I wanted to ask this.
Sure. Yeah, just to chime in. Yeah, so if you install the education data package, that doesn't download any data locally onto your computer.
Right.
And so Matt's right. It's just calling data from the API and sort of translating into Stata, with the exception of when you use the CSV package, then it's pulling from a CSV file that we post on the website instead of the API. Which, as Matt mentioned, is faster if you're trying to get like all the data as opposed to a subset here.
But it's exactly identical if we were to getting CSV versus you are getting from the regular way, right?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, it is much quicker using CSV. I tried that multiple times.
Yep.
Thanks.
Other questions? All right, great. Well, I will stop sharing and Erica will finish it up with the IPEDS finance. And then after that, folks should obviously ask questions about the IPEDS finance data. And then we can also just open it up to any general questions folks have about these data sets and about the tools we've built to access them.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so I've got it queued up to where it should be, and everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, looks good.
Great. Okay, so as I mentioned, we sort of, IPEDS has been collecting data from since the 80s. They've been collecting finance data since 1986, 87, and before that they were it was HEGIS, which is just a different, I'm not going to remember the acronym, but just a similar survey that was collecting the same data prior to that. These data are immensely more complicated than any of the other IPEDS components. The other components, you know, enrollment or something, you're counting students. You know, as I mentioned, there's different ways of counting students. You can do head count or FTE or fall enrollment, but you're still sort of counting students. When it comes to finances, it's really, really dramatically different across the different types of institutions. So there's different types of reporting for public institutions, private nonprofit institutions, and private for-profit institutions. They all use different accounting standards, and so they actually fill out different forms and answer different questions. So in general, the public institutions provide the most detail in their surveys, whereas the for-profits provide the least amount of detail. Moreover, there's been lots of changes in the survey forms over time. So Matt showed you some of the changes for enrollment, but compared to finance, the changes in enrollment have been fairly minimal. There's been some differences in the names of variables and in the racial categories, but it's really been substantively different over time for finance. So that makes it really challenging. So for the first 10 years or so, all institutions reported on the same form, which is sort of colloquially referred to as the common form. And then beginning in the late 90s, they started implementing separate forms for the private institutions. So the for-profits and the nonprofits would fill out basically the same form with some slight differences. And then they implemented an even separate form for the for-profits. So those are often referred to as F2 forms and F3 forms for nonprofit and for-profit respectively. In the early 2000s, they started introducing GASB, so Government Accounting Standards Board's forms for public institutions. So these took a few years to phase in. So for those few years, public institutions had the option of reporting on either the old form, which is called F1, or this new F1A form, and then it became mandatory in 2003. In 2007 and 8, they revised the form substantially, and these are called the aligned forms. And again, institutions had a choice of which form they wanted to report on. So you have different forms for some of those years. And then there's been other smaller changes over time, but then they, in 2013, one of the larger changes is that the F3 forms added a little bit more detail. So they tended to ask the fewest pieces of information for these for-profits. And they're trying to add a little bit more, and it's still not the same as the other forms, but they are trying to get more. So basically, one thing I didn't mention is that the finance accounting standards for the for-profits and nonprofits are known as FASB. So if I use those terms, FASB is referring to the nonprofits and for-profits forms, and GASB tends to refer to the public institutions. But there's of course exceptions. There are still a handful of public institutions that report using the FASB forms instead of the GASB forms. So you can more or less treat GASB as public and FASB as private, but it's not perfectly one-to-one. So that's a lot about what are the problems with it, but what's actually in it. So I'll now talk about each of these components in a little bit more detail. So revenues, obviously, where's the money coming from? Scholarships, expenditures. So those are sort of the obvious categories. For some institutions, there's also information on endowments. And then there's a number of questions on financial position, which is assets and liabilities and different classes of those. Taxes for applicable institutions. So those are, for the for-profits, pensions for the public institutions, and then a number of flags and context variables that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, because those will be really helpful to sort of understand the data and use it correctly, because we've tried to do a bunch of harmonizing when we cleaned up these data to put them in the portal, but there's still a lot of pitfalls and things to be careful of. So I want to mention those. So let's dive into some of these variables. So on the revenue side, the obvious source of revenue is tuition and fees. The first variable is gross tuition and fees, which sort of adds back in discounts and allowances. This variable is basically created it's currently a derived variable, and we created it to be consistent with some of the older data where they only collect gross tuition and fees. Currently, the practice is for institutions to report tuition and fees net of discounts and allowances. Discounts and allowances are basically scholarships. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. We're following the Delta Cost Project's lead on a number of these variables and how to create them. So for those of you familiar with the Delta Cost Project, it's sort of a precursor to our efforts here to kind of harmonize the IPEDS finance data. And they sort of, they stopped in about 2015 in harmonizing the data. So we're not picking up exactly where they left off, but we're trying to take some cues from them. So a number of other sources of revenue: federal, state, local appropriations, grants and contracts. And you'll see that there are also some sort of larger categories. So federal appropriations, grants and contracts, which looks like it's just the sum of these. So these sorts of variables are created because, as I mentioned, the for-profits tend to collect less information. So for example, they will have a broad category like all federal revenues, including appropriations, grants and contracts. And so we've created some of these sort of sum variables so that you can compare across a little bit more easily. Investment returns, contributions from affiliated entities, sales and services of educational activities, and lots more. Auxiliary enterprises. So again, the same thing here, where auxiliary enterprises are currently reported net of discounts and allowances. This gross variable is just included for sort of backwards compatibility. And auxiliary enterprises include things like room and board, as well as sometimes athletic expenses and on-campus bookstore. So it includes a lot of things, and often that's where room and board goes in, but it's often not the only thing in that category as well. So it's a lot of stuff there. So lots of categories of revenue. So hospitals for some institutions. And then we'll have other breakdowns like operating and non-operating revenue, which are sort of summary categories that apply only to GASB institutions, additions to permanent endowments, and then just, total revenue. So that's pretty straightforward. On the scholarship side, different sources of scholarships from the federal, state, and local level, with Pell Grants being an obvious source of those, as well as institutional grants. So I've taken these lists from the Data Explorer that Matt showed you, and one thing that he may not have mentioned is that sometimes you'll have variables that are grayed out. And this is because they're not available in certain years. And so if you click on the little information button here, you'll see which years they are available for. So this is an older variable that is no longer collected. Total student aid. And then, so these are the discounts and allowances that I mentioned earlier that are applied to respectively tuition and auxiliary enterprise revenues. So these are coming out of the scholarships. And then what's left is net scholarship and fellowship expenses. Expenditures are probably one of the more complicated parts of IPEDS finance, because these have changed a lot over the 30 years or so that they've been collecting data. And one of the issues is that there are basically two accounting ways that you can deal with expenditures. You can either treat expenditures in functional categories. So these are kind of, you can think of them as departments or types of expenditures like instruction, research, public service. So those are things that I often think of when I think of how to break down expenditures, is sort of where is it going. But you can also break them down by natural classifications, which are sort of the type of expenditure rather than kind of the department. So these are things like salaries, benefits, operations and maintenance, etc. One of the problems, however, is that in the older years, some of these natural classifications were treated as functional classifications. So operations and maintenance used to be treated as a functional classification and now is treated as a natural expenditure. So that makes it really hard to compare these things from year to year, because in current years, operation and maintenance is sort of a subcategory of each of the functional classifications. Whereas in the past, it would have been already kind of netted out and put into its own category. And so that means that comparing over time, if you're looking at, say, instruction over time, in some years it would include operations and maintenance, in other years it wouldn't. So what we tried to do is reallocate operations and maintenance and some other of the natural classifications, so interest and depreciation, to the functional categories when relevant, so that you would have a more consistent time series for each of those. So these values will look pretty different, at least for the older years, than the ones you would get directly from IPEDS if you were to download the data directly. So hopefully this makes it that you have more comparable categories across the institutions as well as over time. But we had to do a lot of imputations. We had to make decisions about how to apply these, operations maintenance across the different categories. And we basically did it proportionally, but that may not have been the best assumption. So all of these expenditures, except for the last few years, really have been imputed to various degrees. That said, expenditures are kind of squishy anyways. It's pretty hard for an institution to figure out exactly how to allocate expenditures across different categories. It's not always obvious how much of a professor's time is going to research versus instruction versus public service. And so really those categories are, for lack of a better word, kind of squishy in the first place. So a lot of caveats there. We've done what we can and what we think makes the most sense to try to harmonize those. But just so that you know that that's what's happened. So there were a few years where IPEDS provided sort of the full breakdown. So you can think of functional and natural as sort of two separate types of classifications, where you can give natural categories for each functional category. So you could have instructional salaries, instructional benefits, instructional operations and maintenance. They only did that for a couple of years. And in the last few years, what they've basically collected is the total expenditures in each of the functional categories, as well as the salary expenditures in each of the functional categories. And so that's what we've included in our portal as well. Didn't make sense to include data points that we don't really, that don't exist in current years or going forward. So feel free to email me later with more questions about this if you really want to dive into the expenditure data. And that may be a little bit quick, but it's complicated and just heavily caveated. So these are the variables sort of that we're talking about. So these are the functional expenditures. So as I mentioned, you get the total instructional expenditures as well as the salaries and wages subcategory of that. And you get that for research, public service. And then again, we've created some kind of catch-all categories. So research and public service, which is just the sum of the previous ones. But this was created because in past years, the for-profits didn't collect those separately. So they would have these broad aggregate categories of research and public service, or academic and institutional support and student services, all wrapped up together. So currently they do report each of those 8 categories separately, but for older years, they had these bigger categories. So we created those for the other types of institutions as well, so that you'd have some comparability. So hospital services, independent operations, et cetera. And then we also have all of the natural expenditures. So each of these types of expenditures separately should add up to the total. So salaries plus benefits plus O&M plus depreciation plus interest plus other natural expenditures adds up to the total, as does each of the functional expenditures summed up together, the total categories of those. So I'm hoping that makes some sense, but again, email me. We'll give you email information at the end of this if you have more specific questions. We're working on a user guide that has not yet been published, but will be published hopefully in the coming weeks. That will also go into this in a little bit more detail and will provide all of the equations for each of these variables. So it'll show you kind of the original IPEDS, the relationship to the original IPEDS variables and how we did those imputations. So that should also hopefully address a number of questions. Financial position, these are basically assets and liabilities, and there's three sets of categories of these. So there's the overall financial position. So basically the main variables here are total assets, total liabilities, and net assets, which is the difference of those. Slight difference here is that we treat net assets and equities sort of interchangeably, but the F2 and F3 forms use slightly different language, so we've kept that here. And then GASB in the last few years has used net position, which takes into account these deferred outflows of resources and deferred inflows of resources. You can basically treat net assets, net position, and total equity as kind of interchangeable across the different institutions. But that said, I don't know that there is that much value in across the types of institution comparing levels of these amounts. But for the purposes of comparing trends across the different types of institutions, that might be, those would be sort of the most comparable categories. Then we have plant, property, and equipment, which is just a breakdown of the assets in terms of land, infrastructure, buildings, equipment, that sort of thing. And then they, in recent years, remove accumulated depreciation as well. Finally, there's the summary of changes in financial position, which basically just shows you how the net position or net assets have changed from the beginning to the end of the year. And again, just a note here that net assets and equity are used kind of interchangeably, and that GASB uses net position as of 2015. So last few sets of more specific variables. We have endowments for the institutions that have endowment assets, taxes for institutions that pay taxes, and then pension information for GASB since 2015. So more complications related to these data. So, and this parent-child issue happens in a few other surveys as well, but it's most of a problem with finance. So what parent-child reporting is that not every single institution reports its own finance data. Sometimes there might be institutions that are kind of part of a system, so that there is a main campus or a parent institution that reports all of the financial information for all of the campuses. And then the other campuses, the children don't report any data. So Penn State does this, for example, where they report all the data together. You may also have partial children where the parent will report the financial position information, the assets and liabilities, whereas the revenues and expenditures get reported separately for each child institution. So what we've done in our data is we've included every single institution, and some of those institutions may not have any finance data, but you'll see that they're a child, and so you'll get that flag. And you'll also get an indicator for what the unit ID is of the parent institution so that you can link them. You also might be wondering, well, if the parent is reporting all the data for the whole system, and I want to look at, how might I allocate the finances across the institutions if I were to do that? So there's a few different ways you can do this. We've included estimated and reported full-time equivalent counts. So these are from the other IPEDS surveys, which go back to 1997. So we've just included those indirectly. For older years, we've used a formula provided by IPEDS that Delta Cost also used, which is based on the fall enrollment, which is, again, not perfect for all institutions, especially those that have more of a year-round schedule, which basically takes full-time students and then various fractions of the part-time students to sort of calculate this FTE. So this again is pretty squishy, but we've provided it in case you want to have a look at a longer time series. And then finally, there's a parent-child allocation variable that IPEDS has provided specifically for finance that goes back to 2003. In general, we would recommend that most time series analyses, you can feel most comfortable doing most of these going back to about 2003. Before that is when things really start to get a little bit messier. So again, that's where you want to really be careful about trying to, not trying to over-interpret any kinds of jumps or breaks around then. So 2003 is probably a good break point. So other things to know. So I mentioned this, not all public institutions report using GASB. So some of those report using the FASB forms. Pell Grants. So public institutions report Pell Grants as federal revenues and as an allowance that reduces tuition. Whereas some other institutions, most of the FASB institutions treat Pell Grants as pass-through transactions. So that basically means that they're including them as tuition revenue. So it'll look like they have higher tuition revenues relative to institutions that, that don't treat Pell Grants as a pass-through. And they will have, conversely, they will have lower federal revenues. So again, there's a flag for this, and so we recommend using this flag for Pell Grant treatment. So when you're trying to compare among, say, for-profit institutions, that you're comparing institutions that treat Pell Grants the same way. So I'm going to go through a quick example. So this top command here, this is the installation of the education data package, which you don't have to use every time, you just have to install it once, but I've included it here. Again, all those instructions are on the website, but it's just this one line, so that installs the package. As Matt mentioned, if you don't have, there's some other packages that you kind of need to have installed, or it's easier if you have them installed already. So those more detailed instructions are on the website. And then the command is, as Matt showed you, just as easy as education data using the categories, college, the source is IPEDS, and then the endpoint is finance. I'm looking for years 2003 to 2017, and I was looking for a subset to FIPS is 48. So that's you can subset for any endpoint, you can subset to a particular state. So this is the FIPS code for Texas. And then I'm just going to collect a few of these variables and collapse them. And you'll notice that I'm collapsing my form type. So form type is the variable that keeps track of which form institutions are reporting on. So whether it's F1, F1A, so the new GASB form, F2 or F3. And then I just divided some of these numbers because they're really big just to make the scale look prettier. And then I'm going to make some charts separately for public, private, and for-profit institutions. And I'm just going to show you what fraction basically of revenues, total revenues, net tuition is for each of these institutions over time. So this is for public institutions. So total revenues are going up over time with some dips. You can see that revenues from net tuition are pretty steady over this time and increasing, and represent a pretty small fraction of revenues for public institutions, which makes sense because they also rely on appropriations and other sources. For nonprofit institutions, you can see that tuition is a larger fraction of total revenues, and you can also see that there's this huge dip here during the recession. So in total revenues. And then for-profit institutions, you can see that tuition is really, the majority of their revenues. So that's, these are facts that we sort of already knew, but there it is borne out in the data. So final few comments on the finance data. As with any data sets, these data are self-reported by each institution. They're not audited. They might be coming from their audited financial statements, but they're not audited by IPEDS. So if you're looking at any individual institution, I would be very careful extrapolating from any change from year to year or whatever. just because individual level data will always be subject to some reporting error. But for aggregate analyses, like I just showed you, grouping across, like within a type of institution, looking at trends over time, that sort of thing, there will be some errors as always, but that's where we think these data are probably most useful. So again, here's the URL for the portal in general, and the email address where you can email us for any questions. That goes directly to me, so and I'll try to respond pretty quickly. So it's educationdata@urban.org. But I'll pause right here for questions. I see one question that's come in. What is the future of the portal? So we're hoping to continue building on it. As I mentioned, there are additional data sets that we're hoping to incorporate over the coming year, as well as maintenance of the current data sets. So we're working on including the latest years of some of the K-12 data sets, for example, and then in a few months we'll turn to updating more current years of IPEDS and the higher ed data sets as well. Matt, I don't know if you want to speak more broadly about the future of the portal.
Yeah, we're hoping to be able to sustain it over time, as Erica said, keep updating data sets, add more data sets. We're also thinking about other kinds of access tools we can build to make right now we've built the tools to give different audiences access to all of the data in the portal, but all of those tools, even the point and click explorer, can be a little overwhelming because there's so much there. So we're starting to experiment with more targeted tools. So in January, we released a K-12 tool that lets you look up the enrollment by race and ethnicity of any public school in the country, looking back 30 years. So it just generates one chart. So you literally, put in your state and the name of the school you want, and it gives you one chart with 30 years of data, and that's built on the API. So we're thinking of other kinds of more targeted things that would be much more kind of specific. So we welcome if folks have ideas for us, feel free to use that email address Erica put up before, educationdata@urban.org, and send us ideas for different kinds of tools that would be useful in your work, useful to the kinds of folks you work with, because the point is to sort of, we talk about this as democratizing data, making the data truly accessible to different audiences, including folks who, and I think for the researcher audience, for the AEFP crowd, I think these tools are useful because they make things we could have done before, they make it a lot easier and kind of lower the cost of doing the work, which I think is valuable. But there's some folks who couldn't do this kind of work at all, but for these tools, and we also want to make sure we're reaching them as well.
Looks like Robert had a question about public versus private use versions of different data. So all of these data that we're putting up are public use data, of course, and they're all aggregate data. So there's no individual level data. It's all sort of at the level of schools, districts, or colleges. I don't know if that quite got at your question. Is that, or was it something more nuanced that I'm missing?
No, that was essentially it. I just wanted to clarify because, for instance, the CRDC, I know them. They have public and private use versions, and I thought all of it was aggregate. I thought all of it was public in the tool, but I just wanted to confirm that for everybody who's listening, because the CRDC counts for certain things, the public use version, depending on, because of issues with privacy and rounding, sometimes the public version, for instance, of special education isn't useful. So I wanted to just raise that point for everybody here. And to confirm my own thinking.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem, thank you.
And you'll see some of that privacy suppression in the data. So if you look at the K-12 EdFacts test score data, smaller schools are not going to say we got 32% kids proficient in the third grade. They might say we got 30 to 40% or 20 to 50%. It's reported in bins. So yeah, basically any limitations of public use data are also present in the versions we've made available. Any other questions about any of this? I'm impressed we've almost made it our full 90 minutes, even with the online format. Maybe Kim's cat has some questions for us.
She does not. She's satisfied. You
Just a
guys did a
cat.
great job. This is really helpful.
Glad to hear.
Thanks.
Great. Well, we hope folks will keep using this. I guess I would just close by reminding you, yeah, give us feedback, email us at that address. There's a feedback form on the Explorer website. We have an email list that's just for the education data portal. It's separate from, we have other lists where we'll spam you with more things, but if you just want to stay up to date on new releases and things like that, you can go to, I'm pretty sure there's links on most of the websites to sign up for the newsletter. And finally, let us know if you use the data through the portal, let us know, because it's important for us to know how folks are using it. And it's important for us to be able to show our funders people are using it so that they keep supporting this, so that we can keep these tools up to date and keep them around forever. So if you benefit from it, let us know, especially if you want to keep benefiting from it. So we'd appreciate both feedback and examples of how folks are using this. And we have a suggested citation on most of the websites. So one way we're going to try and track usage of the data portal is by looking in things like AEFP conference papers and published papers to see if folks are citing the portal as the way that they access the data. So we ask folks do that just to help us with that kind of tracking, because we want this to be a public good that we can really sustain indefinitely. So thank you all for joining us, and look forward to being in touch.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you all.